Hi everyone, I am Priyanka. So today's topics, and as Sarah said, this is going to be about an hour long. There is some material I cut just because for time purposes and relevance purposes, some things are just no longer relevant, or it's things that you wouldn't need to know today. Okay, so a couple of main content or topic points. We are going to look at basically the difference between the two exams. And that's one of the most common questions I get, which is, how do I know which exam to take? Do I just take both? And the answer is no, because the study strategies for both are different. And because the strategies are different, the actual practice method is different, and you don't have that kind of time to practice for two separate exams. Good news, any university that accepts one exam also accepts the other. So you're not obligated to take both exams because there's a specific requirement for a particular university. All right, then we're going to take a very brief look at the scoring methods. Then there are some upcoming changes that particularly for the SAT. And then we have just a little bit on how do you send your scores, what happens, super scoring, all those vocab words that come into play. And after that, we'll have just the frequently asked questions. If you have any questions at the end, please feel free. Upcoming test dates for this school year, which I believe from what Lucas and Nicole and everyone and Ryan said, I don't think anyone's actually testing this year. So you don't have to make note of those. And of course, I don't like leaving presentations with just here's a package of information. I like to also give out direct steps of what you could do next. So you're leaving here, and no matter what grade your teenager is in, there are still points of action you can take to move forward in your application process. Now, before we actually dive into the SAT, ACT component, I just want to take a quick look at what are the components that make up an entire college application. So part number one is going to be coursework. There's an asterisk there because that is the most important part of the entire application. The coursework basically is an indicator of how you've performed as a student for the past 3 years. Usually senior year grades are not in when the first deadline starts, so it's really just up until junior year. But it's the one consistency in the entire thing. Now, with that said, your grades are in two different categories. You see them as the weighted GPA, and you would see them as the unweighted GPA. And the weighted, so actually, let me start with the unweighted GPA, because that's what we hear about the most. We hear about the 4.0, the perfect 4.0. And that's exactly what the unweighted GPA is at, 4.0. And the difference between the two, unweighted and weighted. Unweighted does not take into account the difficulty level of any course, meaning if a student receives a C in an AP class and a C in a regular class, then that's considered of equal level. So it doesn't matter that getting a C in that AP class was so much harder because it required so much more reading and analyzing and annotating or essay writing or whatever it was. It doesn't matter. However, as opposed to that, the weighted GPA does take the difficulty level of a course into account. So now getting a C in an AP class is still better than getting a C in a regular class. So those are the two major differences, or those are the two differences between them. And grades and any sort of quote unquote college level classes are also very important. So we're looking at AP classes, honors are always great. International Baccalaureate, which Barlow does not have that program, and the closest one is in Norwalk. So I wouldn't worry about that because students from Barlow will only be compared to whatever opportunities are available at Barlow. They're not going to be compared to students who had more opportunities available to them. So that's not something to stress over. Then finally, dual enrollment. So different names for the same program, but really dual enrollment is when students in high school take classes in college, and not AP classes, but this is actually affiliated with the university in some way, and you get direct college credit for it. So to give you an example, West Hill in Stanford does a math class, and that basically it's in conjunction with UConn Stanford, and students basically, they attend class in the high school. It's just that some of the exams and everything they take is just a little bit more at a difficult level. When they finally finish the course, they get college credit for it. So parents have to pay a couple $100s for the course as well. And finally, taking into account is class rank. And I know Barlow does not do class rank, so that at this moment is not relevant to us. SAT and ACT are also pretty important components of the application. Then after those numbers are done, we have the personal side. And the personal side would be the extracurricular activities, which again, that could be anything done outside of the classroom. So it could be the clubs and organizations you join, it could be the sports you play, the volunteer work you do, the jobs you might have, anything. Honors and achievements, that's going to be the academic honors and achievements. And I emphasize that because it's just a separate category on the application. So that's going to be honor roll. If it's Barlow students have that junior writing portfolio that happens, and it's out of a perfect 6. However, no one really gets that 6. It's, as my students have said, it's pretty much impossible to hear that anyone's gotten a 6. Okay, cool. So if somebody received a 5.5, you know what? That's an achievement. So make sure you write that down. Then if, like I said, honor roll, National Honor Society, so anything that's considered an honor, basically. Now, after that, we have the personal statement, AKA the college essay, and finally, or the supplemental essays. So supplemental essays are additional essays on top of the college essay. So you're not just limited to the one college essay that everyone thinks that they have to write. You also have additional writing pieces that need to get done that most people don't factor in and keep time for. So just a heads up, your college writing work does not begin and end with just your college essay. There's more involved. And finally, recommendations, teachers, counselors, coaches, volunteer work directors, or job managers, anyone who's been writing your recommendation. Usually the policy is preferably 2 teacher recommendations and 1 other. Doesn't mean that the university is going to require all 3, but those are just the general guidelines so you know how many people to ask. Interviews that you might have to do, and demonstrated interest. So demonstrated interest would be the campus tours. It would be, do you open the emails that the university sends? Just a tip, open them, or just click on the select all, mark as read when time comes, so you don't actually have to open the emails. If you do genuinely care about the university and they've emailed you, then open the email and also click around in the links that they send you, because that information is tracked. Your online activity as you interact with the website and the university's content, social media, etc., that's all taken note of. Creepy, but at this point, Amazon and they all do it. So I guess it's okay. I can't really justify it. And if I think too much about it, it's creepy. All right, so then we are here to talk about the SAT and ACT. And this is a billion-dollar industry. So I've always said that even though COVID hit and the exams took a hit too, because test optional and so on, that the companies were going to fight to keep their exams, because in 2018, College Board made $1 billion in revenue between AP exams and SATs and selling your information. And ACT made about 300 million. So companies make too much money to just blow off an exam because people don't really consider it as relevant anymore. They will revamp, as is what's happening with the SAT, but they will try and stay relevant. All right, so now let's take a look at the breakdown between the 2 exams. So first up, we have just the structure, and basically for the reading, the reading section is 65 minutes long. And we're going to do that in the next slide. Overall, the SAT is 3 hours long and the ACT is 2 hours, 55 minutes. No one's taking one over the other because you get out earlier. You get out at the same time. And score range, we're going to actually get a little bit more specific into that as well. So first up with the in-depth breakdown. So reading, 5 passages in the reading section, 52 questions, multiple choice, 65 minutes. Consistently, you'll see in the SAT, there will be more time than questions. ACT is a time crunch exam, so you're going to have more questions generally than you have time. And usually it's better for students who do well under pressure. Next step, so after the reading section, we have the English, which is AKA the grammar. And that's basic, just editing. So you have paragraphs, and in these paragraphs, there are certain words or phrases that are underlined, and there are questions posed about them, which is fix the punctuation, which is the right punctuation, or what is the right wording for this? Semicolon, comma, what happens here? Hyphen, and then same idea for both. So this is the one consistency between both exams. Now, although they have higher questions in this case instead of time, rare is the student who does not finish this section. The one reason that students tend to do poorly on this section is simply, or average-ish on the section, is simply because students don't really learn grammar anymore. I mean, your Word document fixes everything for you. Your Google Docs has spell check. Grammarly is a extension, a Google extension that most people have downloaded. So it's not as necessary to know grammar in order to turn in quality work. However, when the pen hits paper, that's when we find out that actually students may not know how to spell the most basic words or may not know how to use the most basic punctuation. So that's where students don't do well on this. With that said, there are only about 14 rules that students need to practice to actually improve your score dramatically for grammar. Then we have the math section, which is 58 questions, multiple choice and grid-ins, 80 minutes. So that's actually broken down into two different sections. One is calculator, one is not calculator, and no calculator while it's, and by the way, since we have parents of younger kids here, this format for the SAT is going to change as of 2024. So what you hear today and right now may not be relevant for your 9th grader, your 8th grader. It's really for the current sophomores and current juniors that have to worry about this whole format. To continue, so as we look at the topics, note that trigonometry is not in-depth trigonometry. It's simply the basic SOHCAHTOA that students learn generally at the end of geometry or somewhere around algebra 2. But there's no in-depth trigonometry. Whereas in ACT, it is in-depth trigonometry. You have to know the content. There's no excuse or anything around it. Like there's no leeway. It's core content, basically. Same thing with the pre-calculus in ACT. So notice pre-calculus is an ACT, but not an SAT. So you have to know matrices and vectors, and basically you have to know a variety of topics for ACT when it comes to math. And even though they might be exercising the basic rules of that concept, you still have to be familiar with that concept to exercise that. SAT, on the other hand, requires less math. So even if you haven't covered, let's say, algebra 2 by the time until you hit junior year or something, and now you feel like you're a little bit behind for the test, you can still catch up. It's not all of algebra 2 you have to know. It's only about 6 or 7 algebra 2 concepts that you have to know. Those can be covered either on Khan Academy with free practice, which is free, or you can cover it with a tutor or in a course, right? So if you find that math is sort of the struggle, then SAT is currently the way to go. There is no official science section on the SAT. However, science, which AKA just means visual based, so the graphs, charts, those types of questions are weaved in. And the ACT does have an official science section. However, it's really more of an extended reading section. No science background is required. This simply means that you have experiment descriptions, charts, graphs, tables on the left side of the page, and then you have the questions associated with them on the right side of the page. With that said, students don't necessarily do well on this section because, one, it's the last section of the test, so they're burning out. But more than that, it's the time crunch. So you have 40 questions in 35 minutes. That's just not enough time to keep going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Again, it's something that you can practice, right? Everything is doable. It's just a matter of practice. All right, so now a little bit more in depth with calculator usage. No calculator section is basically only 20 questions, but in 25 minutes. It sounds more intimidating than it is simply because the calculator is like a sense of security that, look, I can put in 2 + 2 if I really need to on the calculator, which one of my students has actually been like, what if it changed? I need to check it. I didn't understand her reasoning, but I went with it, right? Calculator section is a little bit longer, and they both have multiple choice and grid-ins. ACT calculator is permitted on 100% of the exam. Okay, so when it comes to scoring, let's actually take yeah, so here's a better question, and the most common question I get, which is what's considered a good score? And to give you an idea, a 400 is the equivalent of a 0 on the SAT. So when people say, oh, you get 400 for writing your name, that's basically you got a 0. 1600 is the perfect score. Now, national average, as according to the most recent annual report, is a 1060. And national average for the ACT, so ACT 1 is basically the equivalent of a 0. 36 is the equivalent of a perfect. And according to the most recent report there, the national average is a 21. Now, if you're looking for above average range, then 1300 plus is the above average for the SAT and 27 and above for this. However, I cannot emphasize enough that the score you're aiming for really just depends on the university you want to attend. So when you have your college list, always look for the most competitive university on that list, because that's the score, like that's the university you're trying to get to. So that's a score you need to look for, right? So if a university, the highest requirement is a 1200, well, then you don't need to worry about getting to a 1300. Preferable, I should probably say you don't have to worry about getting to a 1400, right? Because you're not trying to get to that level. 1300 would be great. 1250 would be great. So you want a little bit above the average acceptance, just so the university still, so just so you make the university look good. Your numbers can make the university look good. That's basically what you want to do. Any questions so far? And please feel free to just post them in the chat if you'd like. All right.
Yeah. What ratio of students take the SAT versus the ACT for like the national population? Don't the majority of students take the SAT?
No. So what happens is SAT and ACT are supposed to be competitors. Now, more students definitely do take the SAT, and that actually has more to do with the marketing efforts of one exam over the other instead of the actual difficult. So let's actually go back a little bit.
Do you know what percentage of national students take the SAT versus the ACT?
No, there's no, unfortunately, there's even in the annual reports, there's just, they
the
have their numbers. Right, they have their numbers, so I can
okay, I was curious.
Right. No, on the annual reports, they do have sort of the how many students have taken it, but as opposed to picking one exam over the other.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah, no, that's unfortunately not something that anybody would be able to track if somebody picked one over the other.
Okay.
But yes,
Sorry.
and then, all right, so one of the questions we have is, which test did I say was harder to complete in the time allocated? That was the ACT. So the ACT is more of a time crunch exam, and the SAT is a slightly, when we say it has more time, no one is waiting around for an extra 10 minutes. It's, you have maybe 2 minutes left over, or you finish still right on the dot, as opposed to rushing the whole time. So, all right, any more questions?
Another dumb question. Does Barlow only offer the SAT, or does it also offer the ACT?
Okay, that's actually not a dumb question at all, because here's so when I said that they were meant to be competitors, just to give you like a bit overview of what happens. So on the coast, they were meant to be competitors, and that actually was supposed to make life easier for us, for all the students testing, except instead they partnered up. So now what happens is, if you go to the coast, the East Coast, West Coast, SAT is much more popular, and just because of advertising. And then if you go in the middle, then ACT is more popular. Now, what happens here? Well, what at College Board and some of the states will do is they'll partner with each other. And Connecticut is one of, I believe, about the 5 states or 6 states that partnered with College Board to provide all public school juniors with a free SAT exam.
Ah, okay. Got
right.
It.
So that spring exam that everyone is usually waiting for, that's because the state of Connecticut partnered with College Board to actually provide this free exam one-time deal. But that doesn't mean that students in Connecticut cannot test for the ACT at any point that they want. It's simply that it's like, who has the megaphone, right, to announce it in this case. And when it comes to this area, it's generally the SAT. That's just, it gets all the marketing.
Does the
Um,
ACT get offered at the school? Can they take, can
no,
a student at Barlow take the ACT at Barlow? No.
so, okay, see, here's the thing. If Barlow is your test site, then yes. So, but you're on your own when it comes to the registration for this test, meaning
Got
for SAT, you go on SAT's website on ACE, which is College Board. And then for ACT, you go on act.org. And then once you fill out your registration, you put in your zip code and it'll help you find the nearest testing centers. And from that, if Barlow happens to be, then that's there. But with the free exam, that's on a normal, with the SAT, that's on a normal school day, usually a Wednesday in March, towards the end of March.
Okay.
And no registration required for that one free SAT exam. But no, if you're saying, is it school sponsored ACT, then no, there is no state sponsored or school sponsored ACT, only SAT. I hope that helped. I don't know if I went in
Great.
circles with that. Okay. All right, any questions so far? Okay, all right, so understanding the scoring system. Now, this, while not, we have no control over this curve. This is just something to understand because about 3 years ago, there was the whole scandal, or 4 years ago, there was the whole scandal on equating and why tests are curved. And honestly, it must have been just that point in time when it was time for a scandal, because they've been doing this from the very beginning. Now, here's what happens. So first of all, every single SAT exam and ACT exam is curved. And that is done so that there is no one exam that is much more easier or difficult than another, because there are always rumors about how, oh, the March exam is actually easier than the December exam, or it's better to take the June exam instead of the November exam, or whatever. Like, rumors just get started. And if an exam is easier, it's simply because you're now further into the school year, you've learned more in math class, and therefore you know the material. That's the only reason it's easier. It's not because the test is different. But here's what they do to help sort of mitigate, to ensure that the test difficulty, it doesn't vary. It's called equating, and it's graded on the tests are all, or sections, I should say, not even the entire test. It's math section versus reading section versus science versus English and so on. But it's actually for the ACT, and for SAT, it's just reading versus math. They're all, so taking the SAT as an example, math is out of a perfect score of 800. Now, on a bell curve, about in the middle, that lands about a 500. College Board wants most students to land in this orange zone, which is between the 400 to 600 range, and ideally around a 500, 550-ish. However, if it turns out that too many students are on the higher end, meaning, oh, this math section was actually a little bit too easy, then the entire math exam, the entire math section for all the students who tested on that day will be curved down by 10 points, 20 points, 30 points. Maximum I've seen is 40 points. Same thing on the other end, where, oh, we have students who are a little bit lower. Most students, the average or majority, are on the lower end of things. Okay, well, that means we need to curve everybody up by 10 points, 20 points, 30 points, 40 points max, right? And that happens, there's a separate curve for the reading section, there's a separate curve for the math section. So that means you have 2 exams and you have exactly the same number of questions correct, but you end up with completely different final scores. Now, when you look on your score report, you're actually this is what your report, well, not this colorful, but the order of the scores, this is what it's going to look like. So you're going to have your total score, AKA your composite, and that's going to be out of 1600. So that's going to be the big number, and this is going to be virtual. At this point, no reports are sent via print. It's just going to be on the College Board website. And at this point, every student has a College Board account because they've been taking the PSAT. So it's going to be on the College Board website. The big number is going to be out of 1600. Then they'll do a score breakdown. Okay, here's how you did in reading/grammar, but reading out of 800, and these will be called your section scores versus math. Then they go even further and say, okay, now really the only difference here is they finally split up the reading versus grammar, and that's going to be out of 40. And then there's something called cross-test scores, which will be, and it'll say analysis in science and analysis in history and social studies. These types of questions are actually weaved into the reading, grammar, and math. So the science questions are really just all of those visual based questions, and they're just going to pull them and give them a score of their own. And same thing, same idea with the history and social studies. And finally, there's something called sub-scores, which really, and these are official labels by College Board. And I emphasize that because they don't mean anything. As a tutor, as somebody who works, when I look at this and somebody tells me, or if a student has a low score in the heart of algebra, that doesn't tell me if the student is doing poorly in algebra 2 or algebra 1. And in algebra 1, is it the linears? Is it solving for X type of thing, like solving for the variable? It doesn't tell me that. It just tells me that heart of algebra is an issue, which is not specific enough. But realistically, colleges care for only up until these section scores. No one cares for anything after that. Okay, in terms of essay, it's not even optional anymore. It's not even existent anymore as of, I want to say officially about a month ago, 2 months ago, they've actually just gotten rid of the whole thing. So no such thing as SAT essays anymore. Now, a tip. So again, I'm going to use math as an example, SAT math as an example, because it's just the easiest to explain in this scenario. Grammar and reading have to be combined scores, which the principle is still the same, but it's just harder to show you. So in this case, the blue number is the raw score. Now, this is a rubric from College Board. This is actually freely available on Khan Academy. You can just Google SAT Test 1 and you find entire PDFs online. There are 10 available. And those are just freely released by College Board as sample exams. This is one of the rubrics for those sample exams. Sample exams are actually real exams that were just not used in the United States. They were probably international exams. So with that said, here's one thing about the scores. So first of all, math section, as we said, has 58 questions. Now, these numbers of scores can be, as per the curve, slightly off. So sometimes you can have 800 if you got 57 questions correct, or you can end up losing 30 points, even though you missed only 20 questions, right? So, or only 2 questions. So here's the thing. We said that the average score was around a 500. The student who basically, out of 58 questions, but got the 500, got about 26 to, let's say, 28 questions correct. So roughly half the exam. Goes to show that all of those averages we're talking about are all geared to getting students to a 50% accuracy rate. So students are missing half the test on material they already know, because these exams are purposely designed to play on anxiety, designed to play on the fact that students are rushing. So you're going to purposely, even though the question might be easy, we're going to put it in a paragraph. So you have to look for key information points. And then, of course, just making simple concepts look much more intimidating than they are. Tip. To improve, if a student wanted to go from a 560 to a 580, that's only about 2 more questions correct. Approximately. Always complete 3 to 4 more questions, preferably 5 more questions than you feel you need to. With that said, 1, improvement happens in increments. So if a student is out of 560 and we want to get you to a 650-ish, well, we're going to have to go up in chunks. So now 34 questions correct. Okay, cool. You're approximately around a 560. Every question counts for almost 10 points. We know that to get you to a 44, or we need to get you to about a 44. So almost 10 more questions correct out of the entire test, which means you have all this leeway of questions that you don't have to answer correctly, right? So always be aware of how many questions you can skip, and then make your decisions wisely, because you may not know every concept on the test. Chances are you will, because there would have been some sort of prep involved, independently with somebody, whatever the method might be. But it's just as important to know how many questions you can skip and how many questions you need to get correct. So even before you walk out of the test, you can say with confidence that, okay, you know what, I'm at least in the 1300s. Right? And the same principle applies. Every math question is worth about 10 points, and every reading is worth about 6 to 8-ish. So it might be just easier to round it to 10 and then do a couple more questions just to make it even. All right, so key points. If you understand that scoring system, which is basically that first of all, an average is half the test correct, which leaves you the other half of the test as a whole set of questions that you can use to your advantage, then that works. And then also, of course, that every question is worth about 10 points for the SAT. Which means that if you actually, so with the scoring, that means if you answer even just 2/3 of the exam correctly, you're already at a 600, which is on the higher, which is above average range. All right, so each exam also, in addition to those questions, all the sections that we mentioned, has a 20-minute experimental section that is for the SAT and for the ACT. Proctors may not always tell you it's an experimental section. They simply just roll with it and say, nope, it's part of the exam. It is not scored, and it can be a repetition, or it can be on any topic that was already covered. It can be an additional math section or reading and so on. Why they do that? Well, because of that bell curve. So instead of having to curve the exam and do a huge curve at the end, let's test these questions out and see if students get 50%. If it's at a 70, okay, well, now the questions are too easy, we need to make them a little more difficult and then put them on the real test, right? If the questions are too hard, then again, we need to make them a little easier and then put them on the real test. So it's all based on it's just, the chat. So is the experimental section always at the end of the test? Yes, it is always the last section because they're not going to mess with student performance on this exam. It used to be in the old SAT, there would be one experimental section, one of those that was not graded, and no one would know except for College Board, basically. But no, in this case, it's always at the end. So there's no confusion on that. But students should still answer it, because especially if you're planning to retest, then this is a window into what your test makers are thinking. What kind of concepts are they thinking? Is there math that popped up in there that you might need to review? Were the reading passages extra boring? Did you fall asleep or just space out? Okay, cool. We need to know that, because then we need to know how are we gonna make sure you're able to focus, right? So, and finally, extended time. So extended time in most cases is time and a half. And I say that because it's actually on a case-by-case basis, depending on whatever the medical condition may be. And that is something you have to talk to the guidance counselor and College Board about. So whenever you're trying to reach guidance counselor or College Board, it's easier and way faster to go through the guidance counselor, because something that could take you 2 to 3 months to get done and get a response for, a guidance counselor could take care of in 2 weeks. The communication channel on there is solid. So with that said, guidance counselor, so if you have a teenager who has ADD, ADHD, any kind of medical condition, mental health, and you feel that they do have a 504 plan in place, or they need to get a 504 plan in place, talk to your guidance counselor, because that can still take months. So don't think, oh, because it's January and the March exam is in 2 months, that there's still time, or 1 month. Wow, it's February. That the exam is in a month, that you'll have enough time to get your paperwork together. No, because you don't know how long it's going to take College Board on their end to come through. All right. So any questions so far?
Make sure. Yeah, I have a simple question. Why would a student even bother with the experimental section and not use that allotted time to work? Or is it bucketed and you can only work on the experimental section at that time?
Yeah, so for both exams, you're only allowed to work on the section that you were, and then until when time is called, you can't go back, otherwise you'll be disqualified.
Understood. Yeah.
All right. Upcoming changes. All right, so 2024, and College Board just announced this last week, so it's very convenient that we are having this session today. As of 2024, SAT is planning a couple of changes. One, it's going to be 100% digital, and for students who don't have laptops, they're going to offer loaners. Instead of that 3-hour length that I told you about, it's going to switch down to 2 hours. It's supposed to be similar to the current exam. And again, content is still up in the air because, like I said, they just announced it and we have no samples or anything so far. But when I say it's supposed to be similar, I do know that instead of the long reading passages, which could be a page long of reading or a page and a half, they're now going to do shorter reading paragraphs type thing. So other than that, at the moment, the math content, grammar, everything seems to be similar. it's still going to be scored out of 1600. So they're reading, English combined, and math on its own. And currently students don't get to have, or the only timers in the rooms are the clocks that are in the classrooms. And if you end up in a classroom that does not have a clock, then you're basically only reliant on the proctor to give you your normal 5-minute warning. I usually tell students that, yes, I know most classrooms have clocks or digital watches, but you need to take your own wristwatch with you, because this is too big of a component on the test to leave in somebody else's control. You should have power over something like this. But on the new exam, the timer is going to be at the top of your screen. Those are the only things we know so far. ACT actually had huge changes planned, except they never followed through. They've been talking about them for 2 years, and because of COVID, and it was first supposed to be because of COVID that they wanted to make those changes, or prior to COVID, they wanted to make those changes, then COVID hit, but it was supposed to also be a paper and a digital exam. It was supposed to only allow section retakes, so you can just pick one section you want to take and walk out after that. But that never came through. So ACT changes, we don't know. We're going to keep an eye on it. If there are changes, and they do follow through with what they've been saying for the past 2 years, but SAT at least just declared this. So we have at least SAT changes on paper. All right, now a couple of terminology things. Super scoring. It's a very, very, very common term you're going to hear. And I'm going to, because there are fewer numbers, I'm going to use the SAT table as an example. So when a university says that it super scores, if a student has taken, let's say, the SAT 3 times, then it'll take the highest of the reading, which happens to be on exam number 3, and the highest of the math, which is on exam number 2, and then make that new score the one considered for admission. So even though these individual scores they're always going to be lower than what your final super score is, but ultimately, super scoring just means that they're going to take the highest every category and then just combine those together to give you your best shot. Same thing applies for the ACT. Now, in this case, one of the reasons why I mentioned ACT was going to make changes and then they didn't, because SAT is an older exam because it was much more established, or a little bit more established before the ACT. What happened is that universities started super scoring the SAT and not the ACT. So SAT would be super scored because you only have the 2 sets of numbers to deal with, whereas ACT has more. And and the exam was not really open to being super scored before. Now, super scoring is something that's done 100% by the universities. It's not done by College Board or by ACT at all. They will simply send the reports they need to, and then the university processes those results. So now they're roughly equal, but it's still more common to hear about SAT super scoring. All right, any questions so far? We're running right on time. Okay, all right, so now a couple of logistics for the parents. First of all, score choice versus score history. So if a university claims that it's score choice, it's going to say, you know what, you could have taken the test 10 times, just send us your best scores. And if the university super scores, which normally they do, then for this example that we had, that would have been score number 2, score number 3. University would never know that exam number 1 had ever even been in the picture, right? However, if a university claims that, oh, we do super score, but we still want to see your entire score history, this means you have to send your entire everything. So if you've taken the test 10 times, they're now going to see your 10 attempts, even if they're counting only your best scores. And that if you've done it if you've taken too many retakes, then yes, that can count against you. Ideally 3, just 3 takes and you're done. It's not very common for universities to ask for score history, really more for the very competitive universities. But more often than not, universities are score choice. All right, costs associated and such. So first, actually, let's look at the cost. So to send a score report, it's $12 for SAT, and for ACT is $13. Now, when you register for either exam, you get the option of sending 4 free score reports, which is great, but not really recommended, because when you use that feature, your score report will automatically send to the university, And universities will find out your scores around the same time that you do. So unless this is sort of the, oh shoot, the application is due this month type situation, you don't usually need to use that free report send. However, because most students apply to anywhere on average from 8 to 12 universities in the country, so let's just split the difference and say 10, just sending the score reports could get upward of $100. To help reduce that cost, what universities started doing is something called self-reported scores. And this is simply a category on your college application that says, hey, what were your test scores? What date did you get your highest math score? What date did you get your highest reading score? Okay, cool. And then and when I say, okay, cool, I mean, they'll trust that you are providing the correct information to them. And once you are accepted, they will then ask that you send the official score report. Now, not every university will get the self-reported because it's just a part of your normal college application. However, not every university will accept self-reported. So they're out of, let's say, the 10, maybe you might have 4 universities or 5 universities that accept the self-reported. Well, the remaining, you will still have to send the score report in. But now the cost, it still costs less than having to do all of them, right? So these are the latest prices right now. So we have no idea how much they'll increase by. Usually they'll probably change about 50 cents almost every year, every other year. All right. However, not every university, even great universities require SAT or ACT scores. So other terms you might come across in this whole span of testing and college applications. Number one, a test blind university. And I forget which university it is. It's George Washington, Georgetown, one of them. It's a test blind university. That means you cannot, it's impossible to send your score report to them. And to send a score report, you have to log into College Board or ACT, click on send your scores, and they have a whole, like a drop down thing. You type in the name of the university and then you select the universities that you want. Well, for a test blind school, that name of the university would never even pop up in the drop down. So there's no way they would look at your scores because it's simply, they don't believe in that philosophy of, hey, this is actually a good, they don't buy it that it's not, they don't buy that test scores are a good indicator of student progress and success in a university setting. Test flexible. So NYU is a test flexible university. And what that means that instead of sending your SAT or ACT score in, they will accept 3 AP exam scores. And it's always 3, not just 1 or 2. So 3 AP exam scores as an alternative, or your International Baccalaureate exam scores, which not available at Barlow. So really Barlow students would only be looking at an AP exam score or 3 AP exams. Again, just because one university is test flexible, you might still need to take the SAT because the other 9 on your college list may not be. But again, up to you on that. And then test optional. So this was not common, or yeah, it was not as common until COVID hit. Once COVID hit, now everybody's very familiar with the concept of test optional. And test optional simply means test scores are not required, but can be sent in. However, if you look at the admissions data, most students, almost 60 to 70% of the students who are admitted into universities are the ones who sent scores in. Why? Because number one, your scores impact university's national ranking. So all those, oh, these are the top tier universities, and this is why Harvard is number 1, or this is number 2, or this is number 50, and so on. Well, a couple factors determine that. The GPA, average GPAs of the students who come in, average SAT scores and ACT scores of the students who come in, and how many applications they get, and so on. But basically, when playing this game, always aim for a score that's a little bit higher than whatever their expectation is. So how do we know what their expectations are? And I'm hoping everyone can still see my full screen. Yes? Okay, I'm gonna go with, I think so. Just to make sure, I'm gonna stop share and just share my desktop. Okay, so everyone sees my full screen, and I went to incognito just to make sure that we all end up seeing the same thing and nothing from my search history pops up with this. But now if I wanted to see, let's say Boston College, and it could be, oh, it did pop up for my, let's do admission stats, which is, it's all the same thing. If you look up the name of the university, admission stats, or the name of the university, freshman class profile or first year class they're all the same thing. Now, one thing to watch out for, you want the edu, be nothing against blog post whatsoever. However, there are 2,300 four-year universities in this entire country, and that's a lot of data to update every single year. So a blog post could fall behind. However, for marketing reasons, advertising reasons, universities publish this information on their websites every single year. So this is something you can just pull from their page. Now you'll get the basic information, what they stand for, etc. Really, we care about the data. So we have how many applications they get, acceptance, etc. And then the standardized testing information, which is what we came here for. So in this case, we have an idea. The mid 50% get somewhere around, so the admitted ones, roughly between a 1416, 1540. Now, because those scores are actually pretty high already, I would say get around a 1500 or 1540 and you're good. If you can make it to a 1550, 1560 or higher, then that's ideally what I would recommend. So if a university, for example, has a 1200 as a requirement, then aim for that 1300, right? But always aim for a little bit higher than what the average is, just to better your chances of being accepted. Same idea with the GPA. So it says A minus, well, we can't really go any higher. So in that case, we have to fall into that range. But that is how you figure out, one, what the requirements for the universities you're looking at, what are your goals? This is how you find them. And then second, how competitive the university is and what are the chances of getting in, all of that, you now also get that information here. So every university, first of all, this profile is called something different for every single university, which is why I let Google do the search. The information presented on this stats page is also different per university because there's just no national rule that says you have to do this a certain way. So you might get all of this info readily available, and then you will probably have the data of GPA and SATs most likely available. Some provide SATs, but not GPA. And then you'll always have the diversity info because that's something that they want to make sure you're aware of. They want to make sure that their potential clients know how many opportunities are available, how many ideas and people and cultures they might come across. So that is completely part of that's just what they have to do to ensure that they get their clients. All right, so with that said, then moving on to the last few bits. So if you have any questions, please post them. And this information I don't believe is relevant to anyone here at the moment. Actually, there was somebody with a sophomore. Yes, okay. You know what? I'm actually gonna I'll show you. I have information for you. What's gonna come up in, I believe, the next 2 slides. But before we get into that, so how many times should you take the test? Like I said, 3 maximum. The cost, $55 each. No more essays available. That's not, it used to be different numbers when with or without the essay, but at this point, since there is no essay available, it's flat fee. If you ever hear or have to cancel your scores, simply means that that College Board took your exam and tossed it in the trash. No university ever finds out about it. Now, to cancel your scores, you have 4 days after you take the exam to officially cancel your scores on that website. Really, I don't ever recommend canceling your scores. It's rare that we see this feature ever used. Only time I might recommend it is if you're trying to go to a very competitive university and you have a medical emergency on the day of the test or something, and you just don't want this on your record. But other than that, rare is a student who has to cancel their scores or be absent. But this was more of a FYI. Good time to start testing, ideally beginning of junior year or after having completed Algebra 2. As I mentioned before, if you haven't converted Algebra 2 by junior year, that's okay, because you don't have to know the entire year's worth of Algebra 2. There's a limited number of concepts you need to know. So those are manageable depending on your method of prep. Just to see how you do. So my answer for that is always no. You take a mock exam first, and I will get into the details of that in a bit. But you just don't want a bad score on your file. If it's not about the cost, then ultimately you just don't want a bad score on your records. How long do the scores last? So they're valid for 5 years. And I've gotten that question before when I've in information sessions that I've done where you know, students will come up to me and say, oh, do I want to take a gap year? Do I have to take the test again? Or there was somebody who wanted to join the military and serve for 4 years, and he wanted to know if he had to take the test again. No. Now, if you actually Google this question, you'll find that College Board and ACT will say they're valid forever, which really means from College Board, yeah, sure, your score is always legitimate. However, this 5-year rule comes from universities. Universities want to see your, you know, from the most recent 5 years, basically. And ideally, you want to get all testing out of the way at the end of junior year. So the next steps, and this is, all right, so here's where sophomore parents, this is where this becomes relevant. The summer you have coming up is going to be the easiest summer you're going to have in terms of workload. And again, that's not including any personal plans that you might have. I'm talking about just from the college application process point of view. This is the easiest and summer you're going to have. Ideally, it's better to start test prepping in June and if you're doing the SAT, then take the August SAT. The August SAT is usually the Saturday before school starts. So you would have the first exam done before you ever walked into school, which means low pressure. I mean, most students put off their summer work until the very end, but technically low pressure, no tests to study for, projects to work on, sports really going on. There's some camps, but no real sports and everything, fewer conflicts, right? And in this case over the summer, because there are fewer conflicts. So when I work with students, I don't feel guilty assigning them homework if they're aiming for a significant improvement. Because now if I need you to do an hour's worth of homework 4 or 5 days a week and take a few days, you know, take breaks in between for the remaining days, I can give you an hour's worth of homework and not feel bad that you have the papers to write or the test to study for. And that means, and because it's such concentrated effort, you have a better chance of improving your score. As opposed to, oh, I didn't have time to study and then I had to do this and I was like so tired when I had to do like all of those excuses come up, and they're not excuses, they're valid reasons, but they all come up when you're trying to find time, you're stretching yourself thin basically during the school year. So ideally start over the summer. And this is what I have all my students who I've met in before do. They start over the summer and then look at what happens. Yes, the free SAT is in March. Don't wait until then. Most of my students are done by December because you had and I'm using SAT as an example. The same rule applies for ACT. I'm picking one exam over the other right now for explanations, but SAT. So let's say you take the one in August. Generally, my students will then take the one in October. So this is the first Saturday of October, and it's always the same dates, or sorry, the same weekends. So if it's the first Saturday, whatever date that might be, that's what it is. If this is the last Saturday, whatever date that is in August, that's what it's going to be. But then they generally take the October, and then usually they'll take the December. That way they have a little bit more time to study, which really this is upkeep and doing drills as opposed to, oh, we're still learning core content. Once you're past the summer, we're not really covering core content anymore. We're really saying, okay, you know what? We need to practice your speed. Okay, we need to practice what happens with these particular kinds of questions. Or, oh, you still get tripped up on this, or you're rushing, or you didn't read properly, whatever. Like it's the tiny things that we're just cleaning up. And then you're done by December. And yes, then the March exam comes up. But the issue that I tend to have with starting in March is basically all the other stuff that comes up. So first midterms tend to be in January around Martin Luther King Day. So really that's already prep time gone because most of January is spent prepping for midterms. Then while you can study, but again, test, projects, etc. February break happens. March comes around, you take the test. Now Barlow AP exams are allowed starting junior year. Well, your AP teacher is going to really start hardcore prepping for AP in April. And that's also when spring break happens, but you're going to really start prepping in April because AP exams are the first 2 weeks of May. And on top of that, the SAT that happens in May is the first Saturday of May. So now there's competition for study time. Do you spend time studying for your AP, or do you spend time studying and doing drills for your SAT? Same thing happens in June. Finals come up. Okay, well, this is the first week of June. SAT is the first Saturday of June. Finals, depending on how many snow days we've had, could be the second week of June or the third week. All changes around. But again, there's still a conflict for study time. So as appealing as it may sound, or as not even appealing, it's just the mainstream advice that we receive. It's not always the best idea to wait until second semester of junior year. Then on top of that, this is second semester junior year is a very, very common time to have your college tours. February break, a lot of families go visit universities nearby. April, that's spring break. So once again, families tend to do, even if it's not the full spring break of tours, maybe they'll take a day, 2 days, 3 days to do tours and then do their family trip on the remaining days. So it's a common time for tours. You don't want to try and shove everything if you don't really have to. But yes, so those are what I recommend. Actually, I need to remove the label for the subject test. Those have also officially been canceled. So no longer offered. Please ignore all the purple. Any questions so far? Okay. And then senior year. So senior year applications all open up August 1st. Now I said, oh, that summer between 10th and 11th is going to be the easiest. Well, here's what happens in the summer between 11th and 12th. Yes, you can always, so you first, as you see, I left the SAT, ACTs because you can test up until the month your application is due. So your application deadline is in November. You can still take the November exam, but you would be using one of those 4 free score reports that I mentioned before. However, if you have deadlines in January, well, you can test all the way up until December and still be fine. But not leaving testing until senior year is just, it's very stressful, and preferably avoid it if possible. So now over that summer, when school ends, I usually tell students, okay, take 2 weeks off, get a break because you're burnt out, and then you just start your college essay. College essays will end up starting at the end of June and go until mid-July. And then from mid-July till basically even past application, until about school starts, we're working on supplemental essays, because those essays require research of just, oh, why do you like this university? Okay, let me look at the programs that you have, the professors that you have, the career resource center, the tutoring center, the student organizations. You should be able to name those resources by, like, not a general, oh, I love the campus type thing, but you have to be able to mention the program by name, mention that this is the student organization you're interested in. So there's research time and that goes into this. And we actually end up completing your entire college application. We just don't hit submit because you have to meet with your guidance counselor to open up your Naviance, which will be where you collect your grades and your transcripts and recommendations. So you're not hitting send, but everything is basically ready to go to hit send at that point. Because remember, your grade, you're still doing your sports, you're still doing your test exam, your quizzes, your schoolwork, everything is still happening on top of this testing stuff. Interviews for college generally start around October, November, December, January. So if the interview's in January, chances are the registration deadline was sometime in December. But those are also one more thing to prep for, right? So as much as possible, use those summers very wisely to reduce the workload that's going to come up in the school year. And then we have the first semester. So most common deadlines, November 1st, November 15th, and January 1st, January 15th. However, there is no national uniformity on this. It's really each university for itself. One thing for parents, October 1st is the financial application deadline. So that's not going to change ever. So just please be aware that you have to fill out your FAFSA form by the earlier the better. There's no deadline, but it opens on October 1st. So you want it ideally sometime in October or November. All right, then other than that, so now the next steps. A couple of resources. Like I said, number 1, take a free exam. So when time comes, which is maybe around 10th, 11th grade summer, or towards the end of the year, depending on how finals are, take a free SAT exam. If you go to Princeton Review's website, for example, then you basically have to just Google free Princeton Review, free SAT. once you get directly on their website, enter your zip code and they'll find the nearest testing around you. Same thing for Princeton Review with the ACT. So now that you have a good idea of what a good score for SAT is and what a good score for ACT is, see how you do on both and figure out which exam did you do better on. Prep for the exam that you did better on. And just to show you what I mean, let's not do that. Let's do incognito. So if I do Princeton Review free SAT, well, then usually it's going to be free SAT test, Princeton Review. And I just get to enter my zip code, which that's not it, but it's wonderful that they're tracking me. Anyway, so they'll have the online option. If you prefer that option, go for it. You can also, which I think is the only option they seem to have at the moment because of COVID. So you can enter whatever your zip code is and they'll have the free SAT online. This is part of their marketing. So you're not obligated in any way to sign up for a course following this exam. And you'll receive the report usually within the same week and with the breakdown of scores, strengths, weaknesses, and so on. So that's one thing you can try. Same thing with the ACT, just enter it into Google and you're good to go. Or Bridgewater Prep in Wilton also does the same thing, except they take College Board exam. So as I mentioned before, College Board has 10 exams. You really just Google SAT or College Board Test 1 or SAT 1. It's just going to pop up. It always pops up on Google. And they're going to be usually 64-page actual SAT exam. So what some of the smaller test prep companies do is they'll just print these exams and then just give them to students to take as their diagnostic. And again, one part of their marketing strategy. So there are 10 of these available. And if you even wanted to do this yourself, you wanted to print it, the exam is all there. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And the scoring is also available also right there. So you have, not only do you have blah, 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 not that, but so not only do you have this answer key, but you also have that scoring rubric that I was referring to with guidance on how to actually go about scoring your test. So that's just an idea. Khan Academy is a free SAT source. So basically College Board partnered with the Khan Academy, I believe 3 years ago, to help students from all backgrounds have equal access to prep. So Khan Academy is also, and most students have some sort of an account for Khan Academy. Okay, so the question that we have in the chat is, did College Board say when in March? Oh, when in 2024? So it's going to be, College Board did not declare this. So based on the test changes that happened in 2016, when we had the last SAT revamp, it's going to be in March, which is the first time that the SAT is offered in any new year. So the changes in 2024 will 99% start in March of 2024. Okay, so with that said, now that you know the resources, create a list of 5 to 10 potential universities, note the score requirements as we saw with Boston College, determine what the target score is based on that list of potential universities, allow for at least 3 months of prep time. And again, that really depends on your method of study. So there's some students who love just working on their own at their own pace and they don't need to be pushed and they'll just do it on Khan Academy and figure it out. Then there are students who need a little bit more, what is it? Basically someone, of course I forget the word, but basically they just need someone on top of them or just a reminder. And that can be done via online or just in-person courses, online courses, or through a tutor. Accountability, that's the word. They need accountability. So basically, parents, if you are the one registering your student for your teenager for the course, which is usually what happens, just be aware of your teen study habits, because I've had parents who first registered their teenager for an online course, and then they had to look for a tutor, which is how I met them. But that money that you spent on the online course didn't work because the student never went on that page or went the first day, but never did the work. So just another thing. All right, so with that said, if you have any questions, please ask. Thank you so much for attending. My contact information is on the screen if you have any further questions. And once again, I'm going to go ahead and post the link to the to subscribe. Next week for the email list, I'm going to be sharing how to write an appeal letter for financial aid. So just what's coming up.